In this lecture, you are going to learn about the causes of the Great Depression, the Great Crash, the Dust Bowl, life during the Great Depression, and the Bonus Army. Herbert Hoover served as the head of the Food Administration under Woodrow Wilson and as Secretary of Commerce in the Hardin and Coolidge administrations. Hoover entered the White House as a progressive Republican, urging a limited government-business partnership and a reform agenda that called for a nation built of homeowners and farm owners whose savings were protected and whose jobs were secure. Hoover's ideological and political liabilities prevented him from providing the leadership demanded by the Great Depression. There were multiple causes that led the U.S. towards the Great Depression, including farm income falling, monopolies, growing disparity of wealth, installment buying, lack of regulation, and an integrated global economy. The distribution of wealth in America was badly skewed during the 1920s, and despite the great accumulation of wealth, farmers continued to suffer from low prices and chronic debt. Throughout the 1920s, you will see prices falling with agricultural commodities. By 1921, 22% of the country's farmers had 15% of the country's income. By the end of the decade, it was down to 9%. As prices in the South and West continued their long decline, production climbed, and domestic and international demand for cotton, foodstuffs, and other agricultural products stalled. Widespread soil exhaustion on Western farms only compounded to the problem. Farmers found themselves unable to make payments on loans taken out during the good years, and banks in agricultural areas tightened credit in response. By 1929, farm families were overextended, in no shape to make up for declining consumption, and in a precarious economic position even before the Depression wrecked the global economy. The inequality of wealth produced a serious problem in consumption, and it is yet another cause for the Great Depression. By 1929, 200 companies control 51% of the economy. Their control made the economy more rigid and less fluid. The return of the laissez-faire politics in the 1920s reinforced federal fiscal policies and created a bigger divide. Low corporate and personal taxes, easy credit, and depressed interest rates overwhelmingly favor wealthy investors who, flush with cash, spend their money on luxury goods and investments in the rapidly rising stock market. So the wealthy are doing very well during the 1920s, and although there is certainly delusion of wealth during the 1920s, 75% of it goes to the top 1%. The pro-business policies of the 1920s were designed for an American economy built on the production and consumption of durable goods. Yet by the late 1920s, much of the market was saturated. The boom of the automobile manufacturing, the great driver of the American economy in the 1920s, slowed as fewer and fewer Americans were able to buy a car, and those that could had already done so. More and more, the well-to-do had no need for the new automobiles, radios, and other consumer goods that fueled the gross domestic product, GDP, growth in the 1920s. When products fail to sell, inventories pile up, manufacturers scale back production, and companies fire workers, stripping potential consumers of cash, punting demands for consumer goods, and replicating the downward economic cycle. Even as the economy faltered, Americans' faith in it remained unshaken, and Americans continued to speculate wildly in the stock market on Wall Street. But just like everything, most people who invested in Wall Street were buying stocks on a margin. In other words, buying stocks on credit. Under this system, you only pay a small percentage of the price of the stock you are buying, like 10% of a share, on the assumption that if it goes up, you sell it, and you make your money back. However, if the price of the stock goes down, you have 90% of the stock to pay back, even when the stock ends up worthless. Between 1924 and 1929, the values of the stocks listed on the New York Stock Exchange increased by more than 400%. Then finally, in the autumn of 1929, the market hesitated and nervous investors began to sell their overvalued stock. The dip quickly became a panic, and investors tried desperately to unload overvalued stock on Black Thursday, October 24th. On Black Thursday, $10 billion in shareholders' money will evaporate that day, as people began dumping their stocks as quickly as they could. That evening, J.P. Morgan bought stock to keep the market stable, yet investors still worried over the weekend and sold as soon as the market opened on Monday. Then a few days later, on Black Tuesday, October 29, we see the continuation of the crash. Though the crash alone did not cause the Great Depression, the dramatic losses in the stock market crash and the fear of risking what was left acted as a great brake on economic activity. What also made the crash significant is that most people viewed the stock market as a chief indicator of the fiscal health of the nation, and as the crash devastated and destroyed all confidence, the economy went with it, and from October to November, $30 billion will disappear. Despite the serious problems in the industrial and agricultural economy and in Wall Street, most Americans in 1929 and 1930 still believe the economy will bounce back. In 1930, amid one of the Depression's many false hopes, President Hoover reassured an audience that the Depression was over. But the president was not only simply guilty of false optimism, Hoover made many mistakes. During his 1928 election campaign, Hoover promoted higher tariffs as a means for encouraging domestic consumption and protecting American farmers from foreign competition. Spurred by the ongoing agricultural depression, Hoover signed into law the highest tariffs in American history, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930, just as global markets began to crumble. Other countries responded in kind, ensuing a tariff war, and as tariff walls rose across the globe, international trade ground to a halt. Between 1929 and 1932, international trade dropped from 36 billion to only 12 billion. American exports fell by 78%. Combined with overproduction and declining domestic consumption, the tariffs helped further the world's economic collapse. And by 1933, the U.S. had a 25% unemployment rate, and the national income fell by one-half. Business investment fell 88% between 1931 and 1933. And the gross national product, GNP, dropped from 103 billion to 58 billion in 1932. The frantic reaction to the market's fall aggravated the economic's other many failings. More economic policies backfired. The Federal Reserve overcorrected in the response to speculation by raising interest rates and tightening credit. Across the country, banks denied loans and called in debts. Their patrons, afraid of reactionary policies meant further financial trouble, rushed to withdraw money before institutions could close their doors, ensuring their fate. Such bank runs, as they were called, were not uncommon in the 1920s, but in 1930, with the economy worsening and panic from the crash accelerating, 1,352 banks failed. In 1932, nearly 2,300 banks collapsed, taking personal deposits, savings, and credit with them. To prevent future economic panics, Hoover urged business leaders to maintain production and keep their workers on the job, and he urged labor leaders to accept existing wages, hours, and conditions. The bargain quickly fell apart as demands for production continued to decline, which led to further cuts in production and loss of jobs. Despite his efforts, with each year under the Hoover administration, economic conditions worsened. In 1932, Hoover authorized the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, RFC, a federal agency empowered to lend government funds to endangered banks and corporations. In total, the government lent $500 million and authority to borrow $1.5 billion more for emergency loans to banks, life insurance companies, building and loan societies, and the railroads. He also had the Glass-Steagall Banking Act of 1932, which allowed for more commercial loans to enlarge the supply of credit. The loans halted some bankruptcies, but the trickle-down economic theory behind the RFC did little to help the poor, whose numbers steadily increased. Cries grew louder for the federal government to give hurting people relief, but Hoover's response revealed the limits of his conception of the government's proper role. Hoover genuinely believed that he should not intervene in the economy or in helping the poor, that this was the job for private charities. Hoover's philosophy proved vastly inadequate to the problems of restarting the economy and ending human suffering. The human toll was vast. Unemployment grew to 5 million in 1930 and 13 million in 1932. Unemployment in California was 28% in 1932, and there were 1,000 homes foreclosed each day. And 38 states had to close their banks. Factories stood idle while bread lines stretched for blocks outside Red Cross kitchens. One thing that is often not talked about is the increase in deaths from starvation reported by hospitals across the nation. As jobless homeless victims wandered to search for work, the tramp or hobo became one of the most visible figures of the decade. There was no federal assistance to meet the human catastrophe, only a patchwork of strapped charities and destitute state and local agencies. The Depression deeply affected the American family. Young people postponed marriage and had fewer children, and men lost jobs while women kept them. Rural poverty was most acute, and the tenant farmers and sharecroppers, mainly in the South, came to symbolize how the poverty of the Depression crushed the human spirit. Beginning in 1932, severe drought hit from Texas to the Dakotas and lasted until at least 1936. The droughts compounded years of agricultural mismanagement. To grow their crops, plain farmers had plowed up the natural ground cover that had taken ages to form over the surface of the dry plain states. Relatively wet decades had protected them, but during the early 1930s, without rain, the exposed fertile topsoil turned to dust. And without sod or windbreaks such as trees, rolling winds pick up the dust into massive storms that blotted out the sky, shocked settlers and livestock. This primary source tells the story of the impact of these dust bowls. During last week's dust storm, which lasted 4 days, and in the heart of the drought district ran on for 12 consecutive days, police closed highways to prevent accidents. Airplanes were grounded, schools and businesses were closed. Health officers advised everyone to stay at home. 3 children and several adults were reported dead of pneumonia after breathing dust. During the height of the storm, railway traffic was at a standstill. When high winds swept the dust eastward, Kansas City had night at midday, and people walked the streets with handkerchiefs tied across their faces. How great was the crop damage remained largely a matter of guesswork. Oklahoma grimly reported that 50% of the wheat in the western part of the state was ruined. An Oklahoma man was said to have fainted when a drop of rain fell on his head, to have been revived only when 2 buckets of sand were thrown in his face. The Dust Bowl, as the region became known, exposed all too late the need for conservation. The region's farmers, already hit by years of foreclosures and declining commodity prices, were disseminated by this natural disaster. For many in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Arkansas who were backed out, blown out, and broke, their only hope was to travel west to California, whose rains still brought bountiful harvests and potentially jobs for farm workers. It was an exodus. Oklahoma lost 440,000 people, or a full 18% of its 1930 population, to outmigration. Dorotha Lange, migrant mother, became one of the most enduring images of the Dust Bowl and the ensuing westward exodus. Lange, a photographer for the Farm Security Administration, captured the image at a migrant farm worker camp in Napono, California in 1936. In the photograph, a young mother stares out with a worried, weary expression. She was a migrant, having left her home in Oklahoma to follow the crops for the Golden State. She took part in what many in the mid-1930s were beginning to recognize as a vast migration of families out of the southwestern plains states. In the image, she cradles an infant and supports 2 older children who cling to her. Lange's photo encapsulated the nation's struggle. The Okies, as such westward migrants were called by their new neighbors in California, were the most visible group who were on the move during the Depression, lured by news and rumors of jobs in far-flung regions of the country. By 1932, sociologists were estimating that millions of men were on the roads and rails traveling the country. Economists sought to quantify the movement of families from the plains. Popular magazines and newspapers were filled with stories of homeless boys. Popular culture, such as William Wellman's 1933 film Wild Boys of the Road, and most famously John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, published in 1939 and turned into a hit movie a year later, captured the Depression's dislocated populations. Aside from the farmers, the nation's working class also bore the brunt of the economic collapse. Breadlines, soup kitchens, foreclosures, unemployment, and cold despair drove patriotic men and women to question American capitalism. The American people were slow to anger but strong in protest, and workers and farmers began to mount uprisings across the country. Tens of thousands of unemployed World War I veterans traveled to Washington, D.C. in 1932 to demand the immediate payment of their pensions promised to them in 1924. President Hoover believed the bonus would bankrupt the government and refused to give the veterans their money. When their demands were not met, the veterans decided to camp in the outskirts of the city. Hoover then ordered the U.S. Army to violently evict the bonus marchers from their camps. Meanwhile, President Hoover tried to express his optimism about economic recovery, but amidst the shanty towns and suffering, and then the violent eviction of our veterans, Hoover became increasingly unpopular. His days as president were numbered. That is all for now. To learn more, please watch the next video lecture.